for those that may not have been here last week. Our speaker is the Reverend Dr. Ben Sanders. He is Assistant Professor of Theology and Ethics at Eden Theological Seminary. He's also an ordained minister in the Baptist Church. His subject is race, faith, and American public safety. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Sanders.
Thank you, Gary, as always. Good morning, friends. I've got some slides for us this week. Last week, I just kind of wanted to just kind of generally and broadly introduce our topic. And this week, I want to be a little bit, a bit more on the nose without being hopefully too academic-y or too lecture-y on these topics. But I want to begin this way. In August of 2017, white supremacists gathered in Charlottesville, Virginia for what was branded the Unite the Right rally. The stated purpose of the rally was to unite white supremacist groups in opposition to the proposed removal of a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from a local park. You all may remember this event, even if you don't remember why the event took place. This was the second of such demonstrations after white supremacist Richard Spencer had organized and led an earlier, smaller demonstration to protect the statue in May of the same year. The now infamous rally turned violent when counter-protesters showed up to oppose the white supremacist goals of Unite the Right. When the smoke cleared, one person had been killed and dozens more injured. The statue of Robert E. Lee still stands in Lee Park in Charlottesville. A second, larger statue of Lee remains in Richmond, Virginia as well. Among those who descended on Charlottesville in August of 2017 was David Duke, a well-known white supremacist and neo-Nazi who once served as the youngest ever Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. While standing among fellow racists, Duke was asked what the protests represented and responded in this way. Oh, not there yet. Before I get to Duke's clip, I just want to point out that the statue on the left here is the picture of the Robert E. Lee statue at Lee Park in Charlottesville, and the one on the right is the larger monument in Richmond, Virginia, that was spray painted and had images of, as you can see, Harriet Tubman, BLM, and a quote from Harriet Tubman that says, "Slavery is the next thing to hell." Now, the message here should be clear. This, again, is a Confederate general that these images are being projected onto and that these messages have been spray painted onto. So here is David Duke's response to being asked what that rally meant.
Pick again.
Of course they did. Because sir, what does today represent to you? The camera's right here. What does today represent to you?
This represents a turning point for the people of this country. We are determined to take our country back. We're going to fulfill the promises of Donald Trump. That's what we believed in. That's why we voted for Donald Trump, because he said he's going to take our country back, and that's what we got to do.
Duke, of course, was but one of many well-known white supremacists who felt emboldened and encouraged by Donald Trump's presidency. Yet, despite the unavoidable, undeniable, and explicit support of neo-Nazis, former Klan leaders, QAnon conspiracy theorists, and other persons whose social and political perspectives are grounded in hatred and violence, 74 million Americans either overlooked, minimized, or denied the clear correlation between Trump's presidency and an increase in the public presence of white supremacist violence, and voted to give the incumbent a second term as leader of the United States. To be sure, not all 74 million people who voted for Trump would identify themselves as white supremacists. But any serious consideration of the role of race and racism in our society requires examining how so many quote unquote good people found it possible and preferable to share political space with persons who openly expressed and defended neo-Nazi and white supremacist ideals. That so many persons could simultaneously reject racism, or so they claimed, while voting for a candidate whose social and political vision emboldened white supremacists across the country is more than curious. It betrays an age-old challenge in overcoming racism in the United States. The challenge I am alluding to is this: too many whites who truly wish to oppose racism, and this is especially true in my experience and study among predominantly white Christian churches, too many do not understand or take seriously the legacy of white supremacist racism in the United States. So the last time that I was here with you all, not last week, but the time before last week, we were talking again about Black liberation theology. And I tried to introduce to you all a little bit of the theological orientation of Black theology, particularly the idea that access to the truth of the gospel, to the heart of Jesus's message, requires viewing it from the perspective of those who are poor and oppressed. Some of the reason I'm so committed to that perspective is because it helps hold at bay, excuse me, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. It helps hold at bay taking too lightly, particularly among Christians, the role and legacy of white supremacy in society. Too many persons who neither want to be labeled racist nor be viewed as helping to maintain racism in society possess impoverished understandings of race and racism, and therefore keep themselves lodged within uninterrogated social, political, and religious perspectives that are in fact rooted in white supremacy. So we've gotten to a point in society, y'all, where we tend to think of white supremacy as, as Klansmen, or people who will stand up and say, yes, I'm a Klansman, or yes, I am a white supremacist. Yes, I believe white people should rule this country. But in doing that, what we forget is how the idea of race was created in the first place. So what I've got up on the screen for us to see now is one of the earliest genealogies of, or one of the earliest explanations of race as a category created by a Swedish scientist named Carolus Linnaeus. And his goal, in line with the rise in scientific thinking at the time, right? Remember, Linnaeus is living in a time when the authority of science is slowly but surely supplanting the authority of religion as a way of seeing and thinking about the world. So observation and evidence, observing the natural world, is becoming more and more critical to creating and to sharing truthful perspectives on the world. And inside of the sort of developing idea of modern science, that is where we get the idea of race. It's inside of the work of what is called in historic circles, natural history, which has to do with studying the world in a way that you can explain it rationally to other people. This is where we get the idea of race. Now, Linnaeus would probably have taken umbrage to the idea that he was a racist or a white supremacist, or that he had any sort of ill intent toward the African. But if you just take a moment, and perhaps you have, as I've been talking, to look at these 4 categories and the characteristics that are assigned to each category of persons, you will see very quickly that very early on, as European scientists are developing racial categories, that is, as they are developing ways to split human beings into racialized categories, the characteristics associated with each category already have values that are reflective of social and political practices already ongoing. In other words, slavery is already ongoing. Native American genocide and removal is already ongoing and much of it completed. Colonization of the world is developing in ways that will reshape the world into the globalized situation that we find ourselves in. And inside all of this, Linnaeus and others, Linnaeus is chief here because he gives, again, one of the first classificatory systems that was considered authoritative. We see that Europeans are considered ingenuous, white, sanguine, and governed by law. These are the folks who are meant to rule the government. Now, where these differences came from, that's a whole long conversation that we don't have time to too deep into today. Some folks said it had to do with the climate. Some folks said it had to do with how God intended for creatures to exist. Some maintain that Europeans were the human beings who are mentioned in the Bible as being created by God, and everyone else all other races came from a different origin. This, of course, is a theory called polygenesis, the idea that human nature has more than one origin. But what we see quite clearly is that there is here already a hierarchical spectrum built inside of racial categories, even by folks who would deny that they had any intention to be racist or discriminatory. These folks understood themselves to be explaining the world, and particularly the racial world, as it was, and more specifically as they observed it. Linnaeus's system is important because if we are wise enough to sort of see what is staring back at us here, one need not be a Klansman or a neo-Nazi to hold racist views inside of you. All you need is to have been socialized inside of the right communities. All you need is to have been socialized inside of communities that have not taken seriously the work of being anti-racist and not merely committed to not being labeled a racist. People who would later come to be known as white, especially here in the United States, invented the modern notion of race in order to explain why persons look different and also what these differences mean in the realm of science, religion, and philosophy. The perspective of white scientists, philosophers, and politicians collaborated to create what contemporary scholar Cornel West has referred to as a normative gaze, an ideal from which to order and compare observations of the natural world, including lands, animals, and non-white persons. We can find these racist viewpoints all throughout the structure of the modern Western way of thinking. You can find it in philosophers as central and key as David Hume and Immanuel Kant. You can find it in the thought of Thomas Jefferson and Abraham Lincoln, who we'll look at here in just a little bit. But what I want to get out in front of us here, particularly on the topic of race, is when we're talking about race, we're talking about a category that was invented inside of a system that already had racist practices up and going. And so, as Ta-Nehisi Coates has pointed out in his book, Between the World and Me, race is the offspring of racism. Racism predates the concept of race as a sort of worked out way of talking about different types of human beings. I want us to move now to the topic of faith. There were various symbols of white supremacy present at the Capitol riot. The Betsy Ross flag, Confederate flags, the OK hand symbol, which doubles as a sign for white power, flags that read America First, and even a gallows complete with a noose. All of these symbols were integrated amongst flags supporting Trump's reelection and the promise of making America great again. Also present among the symbols at the Capitol were Bibles, crosses, and Christian prayer circles. This should not be surprising, as exit polls indicate that somewhere between 74% and 81% of white evangelical votes went to President Trump. Between 74 and 81% of white evangelical votes went to Trump. Moreover, in late November of 2020, the Southern Baptist Convention, the largest Protestant evangelical denomination in the US, released a statement condemning critical race theory, a field of study that examines how racism and white supremacy continue to shape our thought and our actions in society. The Capitol riot has taught us more about how white supremacist Christian practice forms Christian symbols, making them into signs of white supremacist hatred. The presence of these symbols reminds us once again that the only way for white churches to be faithful in the struggle against racism is to stand with its victims. You cannot be a compelling, effective anti-racist by staying where you are and claiming that your individual perspective, that your community's perspective, or that your intentions are to be anti-racist. The only way for white churches, for white Christian churches to be effectively anti-racist is to stand with the victims and through these relationships to relearn what it means to worship, to pray, and to hope for God's will to be done. It is not enough to pray, it is not enough to simply pray, to read the Bible, because our prayer and our study must be rooted in an ethical understanding of why Jesus was hunted by authorities even before he was born, and eventually violently executed by those same authorities in ways that mirror the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and so many innumerable others. Developing radical faithfulness in white Christian contexts is made more difficult by the normalcy of white supremacist Christianity. Recall that before the Capitol riot, peaceful protesters were cleared from St. John's Episcopal Church so that President Trump could pose for a picture while holding a Bible. What do these symbols tell us about the meaning of Christianity in the hearts and minds of the protesters who answered Trump's call on January the 6th? And more importantly, what practices, habits, and commitments are at work in white faith communities that will ensure a decisive and unquestionable difference between your faith and the racist faith evidenced in the recent use of Christian symbols in Washington, D.C.? One of the most telling traits of white churches when it comes to anti-racism is where they stand on issues of public safety culture, particularly on issues of law enforcement practices. And this is particularly true in the greater STL region, which we can talk together about here in a little bit. So this is my last little bit, and then we can talk together. In clarifying his perspective on race and racism in America, President Abraham Lincoln once said the following: "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery." This is Abraham Lincoln. "If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the Black and white races. That I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor qualifying them to hold office, nor to intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this, that there is a physical difference between the white and Black races, which I believe will forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And in as much as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." Lincoln believed slavery was immoral, but as president, he also had an obligation to uphold the rule of law and to protect the safety of the American public. And law made it legal to own Blacks and their offspring in perpetuity. Moreover, it is important to note that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't mark a shift in Lincoln's perspectives. The freeing of slaves in Confederate states was a war tactic that did nothing to change Lincoln's views that Blacks were naturally inferior to whites. Lincoln's words can, however, help us understand the racism of American public safety culture. The 16th US president is often celebrated for helping bring an end to slavery. But Lincoln, like many white Christians today, was not determined to be an anti-racist. His primary concern was the protection of the American social order, a social order that presupposed the idea that white people were superior. After a grand jury decided not to indict Darren Wilson in the killing of Michael Brown Jr., President Barack Obama began his address to the tense nation by reminding his audience that, quote, "First and foremost, we are a nation built on the rule of law." I have a clip here from Obama, but I think it's too long for us to watch together, so we won't. He added that the anger felt by many was understandable and urged peaceful protest in the light of the decision. Obama urged officers to work with communities instead of against them. And he reminded the country of a deep distrust between law enforcement and communities of color. He named various approaches to reforming law enforcement culture and reminded us that, quote, "There were good people on all sides," sound familiar, "of the law enforcement debate who were interested in working to create positive change." Like President Lincoln, President Obama brought his own personal convictions about structural racism to bow before the rule of law and order. The interpretation and application of laws used to protect the safety of the American public are seemingly incapable of protecting citizens of color, especially Black and brown communities, from the legacy of faith-driven racism. Americans of various political orientations maintain faith in our country's ability to create a more perfect union. But these visions of perfection, regardless of political orientation, tend towards the same approach when it comes to white supremacy. It must be slowly, painstakingly socialized and legislated away. Meanwhile, Black and brown families continue to bury loved ones killed by those entrusted with protecting the law. What American public safety culture needs is not gradual reform, but radical transfiguration. The type of transfiguration we encounter in the Gospels when Jesus takes Peter, John, and James up a mountain to pray, and there they behold Jesus as never before. To be transfigured is to be made more beautiful. For the disciples, this meant being able to see Jesus and his purpose more clearly and in ways that brought them to their knees and onto their faces. What would it mean for white churches to have their perspectives on public safety and law enforcement transfigured in light of all of the brown and Black sisters and brothers killed in the name of so-called law and order? What would it mean for your faith to be brought to its knees and onto its face in the name of transfiguration and in the work of welcoming God's justice? Okay, friends, that's what I have to start us off this morning. I wanted to just, again, get in front of us some work and thinking around the concepts of race, faith, and American public safety. So last week, I just kind of wanted to float the concepts. And this week, I hope I've given us at least a little bit more of social and historical context so that we can think about sort of how I'm thinking about these words, race, faith, and American public safety, and what I'm welcoming you to come and consider with me. So with that, I'll stop talking and listen to what you all have to say or ask. And I'm going to just be jotting some notes as I do that.
The question, wasn't the lower status of women in society also based on the law? And how long has it taken to overcome that? Little law, by article here, by change of voting rules, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. That is absolutely the case. And when we look at the experiences of women, there is a marked difference between the experiences of white women and the experiences of women of color, which is why the issue of race, it's not that this is the only, when I teach my intro to Christian social ethics class at Eden Seminary, we address gender injustice. We address injustice when it comes to sexual orientation. We address environmental injustice and environmental racism. We address racism as well. We address how misinterpretations of the Bible are forms of violence or can be forms of violence. The reason I'm inviting us to focus on race is because you all live with me here in Greater STL. And we got a particular problem that we got to deal with, not in the realm of ideas, but on the ground and the concrete structures that shape our lives. So that's why this my thoughts and my the sort of research I'm working on for a class that I'm teaching at Eden Seminary. I think I told you all last week that these are notes from a class that I'm teaching this semester. So this is, I'm inviting my students to think about the real stuff that's going on where I know they live. But yes, of course, right? Yes, absolutely. Other thoughts? You're allowed to disagree or say amen. I know y'all better than this.
Well, I much respect much of what you say, but the trouble with the Brown case and the lack of prosecuting of the policeman that shot him is that policeman was under assault at the time by Brown. And so it seems to me you got to solve the problem of what to do about the few, of course, black men that attack policemen. What's your response to that?
My response to that is we do not have historic patterns of black citizens going out of their way to attack armed police officers. What we do have on record, and both in written record and legal record, affirmed by studies carried out by the federal government's Department of Justice, and in the oral and oral histories of communities of color, are long histories, documented histories, centuries of histories of law enforcement agents going out of their way to abuse, to maim, and to kill people of color because they are people of color. I would also add that there's ample evidence that your account of what happened to Michael Brown Jr. is far from confirmed. The idea that Darren Wilson was being attacked by Michael Brown is something that I think we absolutely positively have to call into a question. And if you're open to doing some research that would help you question that assumption, then I would invite you to watch 2 documentaries. I would invite you to watch a documentary called Stranger Fruit, which of course is a play on Billie Holiday's classic song, Strange Fruit, about the history of lynching. And I would also invite you to watch a documentary called Whose Streets, a documentary that focuses on the uprising that developed in St. Louis after Michael Brown was killed. There are also many, many texts that challenged the narrative that Darren Wilson was reasonably fearing for his life. And this, of course, is a regular excuse that police officers and just regular white people. I mean, think about the case of Trayvon Martin. I use the case of Michael Brown in this particular talk because it's local. But think about Trayvon Martin. Was George Zimmerman being attacked? No, he followed Trayvon Martin after he was explicitly told by a 911 operator not to do so. So, the idea, if you want to, we could have a conversation about Michael Brown Jr. We could go back and forth on the facts of the case and where there's conjecture and where there's not. But I think that for reasonable people, particularly reasonable people who are actually interested in injustice and not just in protecting things as they are, we've got to look at social and historical patterns. And at this point, if we're still not believing Black and brown communities who are saying the police have been doing this to us for decades and centuries, then we may be stuck in an impasse.
My sister lives in Minneapolis, and this summer was really taken back by the violence, which was really when Floyd was murdered. She was taken back, and we had a lot of talks about racism, and she's a very open-minded person, like we all are, right? But we all have racism in our blood, in our history. And so I finally said to Laurel, in St. Louis and at St. Timothy's, we didn't come to grips with this until we stopped asking who else came into St. Louis to participate in the riots. This didn't happen in St. Louis, it happened in Ferguson. Mm-hmm. until we recognize, until I recognize that I'm a part of all of this, and I'm working damn hard to do what I can. But until I stop pointing to the fact that Michael Brown was not the best example, or I stop pointing to the fact that women also went through this, and I'm not being critical of anyone here. I've done the same thing in my journey already. But until we start reading these books about anti-racism and realizing that there's racism in all of us that were brought up in a white system, and to look at how it's systematic and how we have to change the system, nothing's going to change. And it's very humiliating for me to say, you know, I've been working on racism for in myself for 30 years, and I'm still finding things in myself that I don't like. So I just think it's easy to look other places for this sort. I'm talking too long. I've said it.
No, Dan, I think you're absolutely right, and I think that what you're raising, the words you speak are on the nose. You're hitting the nail on the head, and I think what you're raising for us is what I'd like to refer to as an epistemological issue. Epistemology and philosophy has to do with how we know what we know. How do we know what we know? How our perspective shapes. None of us comes into this world seeing the world the way that we see it now. We've been taught by folks. We've been told stories about why those people are that way. We've been told stories about the nature of American public safety. We've been told stories about the role of faith in a good life, right? Those stories help us to see Michael Brown Jr. as an imperfect person and Darren Wilson as someone who is defending his own life, while overlooking Darren Wilson's own record as a very problematic law enforcement officer before he encountered Michael Brown Jr. That's public record. That's public record. Michael Brown was no angel. I've sat with Michael Brown's father, had him come to one of my classes at Eden Seminary. His son was not perfect. He knows it, I knows it, and anyone who knows him knows it. But he should also be alive. And the reason he's not alive is because we have created a social structure in which it is acceptable for officers to use the rationale of fearing for their lives to use lethal force on citizens. And those citizens are almost always, the citizens are disproportionately, I should say, African Americans. I think the most recent numbers that I saw are that while African Americans remain 13 to 14% of the American population, they account for 25% of those persons killed by police. I mean, and of course, if you look at the white numbers, the percentage of white folks killed by police officers is much lower, or significantly lower rather, than white folks represent the general population. So we see that police kill people of color at highly disproportionate rates, and that shouldn't surprise us if we know anything about history. And as I alluded to last week, the ways in which America's law enforcement culture grows right out of plantation overseer culture. And we've never problematized those things. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act don't count because people had to bleed and die for those things to come about. And there are major questions about whether or not the intended social and political consequences of those acts have even come about, right? St. Louis is one of the most segregated cities in terms of where people live in the country. Why is that? Why is that? Why is it that in a city like St. Louis, white folks for decades now have continued to find ways to not live near Black people at all, period, point blank? Why is that? Is that because it's just, white people like to live together and Black people like to live together? I know that that's not it. I know that that's not it, right? So we've got to be able to have honest conversations about the relationship between how we teach police to police and our actions of where we send, choosing where we send our kids to school, choosing where we live, choosing voting on how our tax dollars are going to be used by local government, right? We've got huge issues on the state level. But on the more local level, there's a whole lot more that we can be doing that we're not doing. And part of the reason we don't do it, to get back to what Jan was talking about, are because so many of us have been programmed to not question how we know what it is that we think we know.
Well, I think there's also people giving lame excuses and expecting that they will not get in trouble or that we accept them. I mean, and I think of two incidences. The guy who was supposed to be a neighborhood watch person who left his house and shot that guy. The neighborhood watch doesn't run like that. And nobody said neighborhood watch person would call the police, not go out themselves. I mean, it just, this is the way it happened. This is the way it happened. Nobody straightened out the difference between doing that and being part of the neighborhood watch. The second one was it Michael Brown that was shot by the police up in Ferguson?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, this guy, after he shot him,
Yes.
here comes the newscast. And they say, well, you know, he stole something from this store. And the policeman says, and I told him to put his hands up, and he looked like a big ape walking toward me. And I was afraid. Now, number one, the policeman didn't know anything about what he stole.
That's absolutely correct.
And here he is, a big black boy. I don't think he was a man, walking toward the policeman. If he says, put your hands up, and the policeman is afraid and shoots him.
Yeah.
And I think when they justify this stuff, this behavior, we forget to look a little deeper. To say, does that make sense? Or are they just saying something to justify what has happened to this boy?
Yeah. Carolyn, yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and often if you think about it, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah. No, it doesn't make sense if you, so here's the thing, right? And this was really at the heart of the Black theology work I came and did with y'all. It only makes sense if you continue to disbelieve the folks who are marginalized in society. Those are the only grounds on which it can make sense. You have to take the stories that Black and brown communities have been telling for decades, for centuries, and you have to say those just aren't true. If you listen to those stories and you allow those stories to shape your understanding of contemporary structural issues, then you can get to real issues. Then you can get to a real understanding of our structural problems. And I really believe we can begin to discover some solutions. So you'll see in places like Austin, Texas, they've just reallocated a bunch of money that's typically dedicated to policing to create housing for homeless folks. There are other cities that have figured out, you know what? Law enforcement officers who know the people in the communities that they police are far less likely to ever resort to lethal force. What the heck is Darren Wilson doing in Ferguson where he doesn't know anybody anyway? Well, he's going to work, he's getting a paycheck. So what would it mean to start to think about hiring police officers and training police officers to work in communities where they will already have established relationships, and not just to clock in to protect the city, to uphold the law in the presence of folks that you don't know and have been socialized, to Carolyn's point, to be afraid of. I dare argue that Darren Wilson was afraid of Black kids like Michael Brown before he encountered Michael Brown that day, because he had been socialized to be afraid, for the same reason that so many white women clutch their purses when I get in the elevator. The same reason that when I walked into an open house up the street from my house yesterday, literally, this is maybe 6 houses down from me. It was Saturday. I'd finished much of the work that I needed to do for us today. And I said, hey, there's an open house down there. My wife is at home pregnant. She doesn't want to go. I said, I'm going to walk down there and check it out. And so I walk into this house that's 6 houses down, and the guy looks at me like I'm in the wrong place. Not, can I help you? Are you interested in the house? Right? He told me, I'm not quite done with this couple yet. Hold on. Now, these are experiences that I've had all throughout my time being alive, but particularly here in St. Louis. And the thing that just baffles me about racism here in St. Louis is it's so clear to everyone who looks at St. Louis from the outside or who has lived here and left. But it's here in St. Louis where it just feels like we won't grab it and say, yeah, this is our issue and we're going to fix it. We're going to fix it by how we vote. We're going to fix it by how we choose where to live. We're going to fix it right. I mean, it's there. It's so evident. It's been affirmed by scholars and politicians and folks who study and folks who use mediums of study that we typically respect, scientific-based studies, right? I'm not talking about propaganda. I'm talking about the Department of Justice. I'm talking about scholars who work at reputable universities, right? And it just seems that, and this was really my point with that whole Linnaeus slide, right? Carolus Linnaeus did not understand himself to be a white supremacist. And despite the fact that he had never been to many of the places and had never met many of the people that he was describing, he just thought that he was using the best knowledge that there was to be had about the types of people that live in the world. He had nowhere near as he didn't have the kind of means that we have now to access a very different way of thinking about race, faith, and public safety. We don't have those same excuses. So then the question I think that I would leave with you all is, what would it mean? What would it look like for St. Timothy Episcopal to take seriously the work of transforming public safety culture where you live, with appeals to your faith, the best of it, and appeals to what you know to be true about race and racism in America? What kind of events might you plan? What kind of conversations might you schedule? What kind of changes might you push for? What stories might you need to hear? What stories might you need to retell in order to really be able to make some tangible, meaningful impacts on the community and on how the community is policed? That's mostly a sort of long, wordy, rhetorical question, but I really do think that there is that there's stuff in there that could bless us and transfigure us.
Carl Linnaeus was an interesting guy. He, as a biologist, he formed the current system that we use of binomial nomenclature for classifying all species on Earth.
That's right.
So
he's the root of all of that stuff, like modern biology. You can't get it without going through
I mean,
Linnaeus.
he's probably arranging his M&Ms on his plate kind of thing all the time.
That's
too,
right. That's right.
know?
That's right.
But the scholarly work that he had done to classify living organisms was gave him the prominence that if he's going to classify, let's also go ahead and classify humans.
Yes. Yes. And what happens when he gets to humans, right? He's like, so this is the thing, right? I mean, it would be one thing to describe the physical differences, right? And maybe some of the cultural differences, but the language that Linnaeus turns to is clearly value-laden. And it's reflective of not just sort of scientific, not just the contemporary, what was his contemporary scientific discourse. It's also directly related to the sort of colonial logic that's being reified at that point, right? The idea of white supremacy, because remember, by the 1700s, what's going on here in the United States? The first slaves we know get here in 1619 at Jamestown, right? What Linnaeus is doing is not just explaining, he's justifying global political practices. Now, I'm not saying that he was doing this on purpose. I'm saying that because of the discourse that he was inside of, whether or not it was his intention to be a racist in the way that he categorized human life, he did it. And much of the reason he did it is because he didn't question how he knew what he knew about other peoples.
That's the point about Linnaeus that I have. Linnaeus was in Stockholm, in Sweden. On what authority, based on what experience, based on what science, did he assign those adjectives to yellow, red, and black people?
It's based on the authority, the experience, and the science of whiteness.
Linnaeus never was in the United States.
Never.
Linnaeus was never in Africa.
Never.
Linnaeus never set foot in Asia.
Nope.
Yet, he took it upon himself to categorize the people in those continents with adjectives that were used, and here I'm going to be rough on religion. 100 years before he wrote those things about race, the same things were written about the Catholics,
Yep.
the Calvinists,
Yep.
the Lutherans. In the 30 Years' War, where about 30% of the people in Germany died,
Yep.
because of throwing adjectives at each other. And those were all white people.
No, that's right. In my class, Mark, where we've got a semester to deal with these issues, one of the things we're looking at is the relationship between anti-Semitism in Christian history and the emergence of white supremacy. The ways in which Christian teachings about the Jews and the ways in which the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus become like social and political forms, social and political justification for excluding and massacring the Jews. This way of thinking about what it means to be a Christian, right? To have the moral authority to murder the murderers of Jesus, right? That something happens. There's so much more we have to talk about to sort of address that, right? The sort of imperialism that's already at work in Christianity by that time. But this idea that the role of Christians is not to bear witness, but to control the world. And this is really one of the places where an interrogation of white identity, particularly in the United States, but also more broadly, is really important, right? This idea that white folks, and we can see this in Linnaeus, that white folks are meant to run the world. That whatever else is going to happen, it's clear that the ones who should be governing the world and making the most important decisions are white folks. Now, I'm just going to say this, and I try not to get too political, though I talk about politicians because they're important symbols. I think that one of the things that made Donald Trump possible was President Obama's 2 terms in office. I don't think that we understand as a nation, or at least that we won't accept as a nation, what a Black man standing behind the presidential seal as president did to the collective psyche of white folks who for centuries have been taught in implicit and explicit ways that this country and this world is yours to govern and develop. I don't think we've yet gotten into the depth and the sort of trauma that this has created for so many folks. And I think that until we do that, we're gonna because what we're sitting in right now, there's a lot of discourse right now about political polarization, and we've never been this polarized before. To which I respond, have you ever heard of the Civil War? Political polarization is not a new thing in the United States. What's new is that what is now the Democratic Party is being urged to find ways to cooperate with a Republican Party that has given itself to forms of social and political argumentation that cannot be justified with reason and science. How can you work with folks? Like if I say, okay, we're gonna work together on a project, but I'm gonna refuse to acknowledge that rain falls from the sky. We're gonna study rain together, but I refuse to acknowledge that it falls from the sky. I mean, that may sound like hyperbole, but if it does, it's only because you haven't read some of the theories that some Republican leaders hold about what is happening in the Democratic Party and what they're trying to protect folks from, right? I mean, I think that one of the best pieces of evidence that we have for how compelling white supremacy remains, and when I say white supremacy, I don't mean like being a Klansman or a neo-Nazi and having swastikas tattooed on you. I mean just the idea that white people are superior and are meant to control society. I don't think we fully come to terms yet with what it means to challenge that idea for so many folks who have been in this country for generations. Yes, please.
I'm Tony, and I'm with Leslie.
Hey, Tony.
Yeah, great to see you again, Doctor.
Good to see you too, man.
Okay. We could go live in the 1700s. We could go live over there. We could go talk about there. In the month of February, a group of St. Timothy's parishioners has put together a series of videotapes, a crossword puzzle, and maybe some other stuff. We've looked at one videotape already to celebrate Black History Month. Black History Month is a good month. The other 11 months are good for Black also. Let's not get into that discussion. Who on this video will join me and other members of our Ministry of Racial Reconciliation, view all that information, take notes, and then let's get together at the beginning of March and talk about what we learned. Who will do that?
Ben said yes.
Oh,
We'll do it.
Yeah, everybody said yes.
thank you. Amy, Jane, I'm sorry for taking over the more stuff, but I just was compelled to put that out there. And I see a lot of raised hands. Email me if it's okay with Jane and Amy, and I will organize a Zoom discussion in the early part of March. Who will join me?
I'm coming with you, Tony.
Okay, I got, oh yeah, I love it. So please.
I'm coming with you.
Email address, agcore@mac.com.
Let the minutes reflect that Tony started this.
And Tony will finish it.
I love it. I love it.
What will you
I love
do?
it.
Okay.
Please, I raised my hand, not in jest. I understand that you're working on stuff with the congregation there, but I truly mean that anytime I come to preach or teach at churches, it's just sort of a Black church thing in me. I consider you part of extended family. So if there's ever anything that I can do to be a resource, I would love to. I always enjoy my time visiting with you all at St. Timothy. So if there's any way that I can be a resource, as I'm noticing that we're at 10:40 and I want to honor you all's worship time as well. Please, my email address is still just bsanders@eden.edu. You can email me, you can call me. I continue to pray for you. I continue to be grateful that you exist as a congregation in this wonderful region that just needs a lot more prayer and the kind of stick-to-itiveness that we're hearing on the call this morning. So thank you, friends, for being such good hosts when you welcome me, and as always, I would be glad to come back when I'm working on something else that you all will give me the wonderful opportunity to share and to develop with you all. Blessings on a powerful worship experience.
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Thank
time.
you.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders.
Thanks so much, y'all.